Part 3, The Big Lie, How Governments Controlled Minds and Lives. The initial fanfare of August 1914 had promised a quick, glorious victory, a heroic endeavor undertaken by men in uniform while life at home continued relatively untouched. This was the first big lie of the Great War. As the conflict devolved into a grinding, industrialized behemoth, the lines between combatant and civilian, between front line and home front, blurred and then vanished entirely. Governments, desperate to sustain the unprecedented demands of total war, began to exert an iron grip over every aspect of their citizens' lives, transforming economies, upending social norms, and exposing entire populations to new, unimaginable terrors. The world was truly under siege, and the war was fought not just by soldiers in trenches, but by every man, woman, and child who breathed its poisoned air. Chapter 9, The World Under Siege, Life Behind the Lines in Total War. The declaration of war in 1914 might have suggested a clear division between those who fought and those who waited. 4 years later, that distinction had been utterly obliterated. The Great War became the first true total war, demanding not just the mobilization of armies, but the complete reorientation of entire societies. Every factory, every farm, every household, every citizen became, in essence, a combatant. This profound societal transformation was driven by the insatiable appetite of the front, creating a new, pervasive kind of pressure and suffering behind the lines. The war economy, when every citizen became a soldier. The scale of modern warfare was utterly unprecedented, requiring a constant, gargantuan supply of everything from shells and steel to boots and bread. To meet this demand, nations transformed their entire economic structures, placing every resource and every individual at the service of the war effort. Factories of fury, industries churning out death. From the moment the initial rush of volunteers subsided, governments realized the war would be won or lost not just on the battlefield, but in the workshops and factories. Civilian industries, once dedicated to consumer goods, were ruthlessly converted to war production. Car manufacturers began churning out tanks and armored vehicles. Textile mills wove uniforms and blankets. Chemical plants, previously making dyes or fertilizers, now produced explosives and poison gas. This was a relentless, all-consuming push for production. Workers toiled long hours, often 6 or 7 days a week, in noisy, dangerous environments. The demand for shells, rifles, artillery pieces, and myriad other war materials was insatiable. Every bullet fired, every uniform worn, every trench dug, represented an immense industrial effort behind the lines. This massive redirection of productive capacity meant civilian markets were starved, setting the stage for widespread scarcity. The hand that feeds, rationing, shortages, and starvation. As men left farms for the front and industries switched to armaments, agricultural output plummeted. Simultaneously, naval blockades, particularly the British blockade of Germany and Austria-Hungary, choked off vital imports of food and raw materials. The result was widespread scarcity and severe hardship for civilian populations. Governments across Europe implemented rationing systems for virtually every necessity: bread, meat, sugar, butter, coal, and even clothing. Families received ration cards, entitling them to meager allowances. Black markets thrived, but for the majority, life became a constant struggle to find enough to eat. In Germany, the impact was particularly devastating. The British blockade, coupled with poor harvests and a breakdown in distribution, led to the infamous Turnip Winter of 1916 to 1917. Potatoes, the staple, failed, forcing the population to subsist largely on turnips, which were used for everything from animal fodder to substitutes for coffee, bread, and even meat. Malnutrition became rampant, and thousands, particularly children and the elderly, died from starvation and diseases exacerbated by weakened immune systems. This brutal experience profoundly impacted civilian morale, sowing deep resentment and contributing to the eventual collapse of the home front. Funding the fire, war bonds, loans, and the looming debt. Financing a war of this unprecedented scale presented an enormous challenge. Nations resorted to various methods to fund the insatiable demands of the front, setting the stage for future economic instability. A primary method was the sale of war bonds and loans. Governments launched massive propaganda campaigns, appealing to patriotism and encouraging citizens to invest their savings in the war effort. Posters implored people to buy war bonds, or lend to your country, promising a secure return and helping to kill the Hun. While successful in raising capital, this also shifted an immense financial burden onto future generations. Nations also relied heavily on borrowing from abroad, particularly from the United States, which remained neutral for the first 3 years and whose economy boomed supplying the belligerents. The Allies accrued enormous debts to American banks and the U.S. government. Finally, many nations simply resorted to printing more money, which inevitably led to rampant inflation, further eroding the value of wages and savings, and exacerbating the hardships faced by ordinary citizens. The Great War left an indelible legacy of colossal national debts and economic instability that would plague nations for decades, directly contributing to post-war grievances and crises. Government's iron fist, state control of everything. To manage the immense demands of the war economy, governments on all sides expanded their power and control over society to an extent previously unimaginable in liberal democracies. This was the dawn of truly centralized, bureaucratic states. Governments began to directly control industries, dictating what factories produced, setting quotas, and even nationalizing key sectors. They imposed direct control over agriculture, directing farmers on what crops to plant and managing food distribution. Labor was directed, with restrictions on strikes and the movement of workers. Prices were fixed, rationing boards regulated consumption, and transportation systems were brought under state authority. In Britain, the Defence of the Realm Act, DORA, passed in 1914, gave the government sweeping powers to requisition property, control industries, censor the press, and even intern individuals without trial. This dramatic expansion of state power transformed the relationship between citizen and government, laying the groundwork for greater state intervention in the post-war era. Women on the front line, reshaping society forever. As millions of men marched off to the front lines, a vast void was created in factories, fields, offices, and even military support roles. It was a void that only women could fill, and in doing so, they initiated a quiet, yet profound, revolution that reshaped society forever. The unseen army, women in factories, fields, and hospitals. Before the war, women's roles were largely confined to the domestic sphere or specific women's work like teaching and textiles. The war changed everything. Suddenly, millions of women stepped into jobs previously held exclusively by men, forming an unseen army that was absolutely crucial to sustaining the war effort. They became munitionettes, working in armament factories, often for 12-hour shifts, in dangerous, toxic environments. Handling TNT, trinitrotoluene, turned their skin, hair, and even sweat yellow, earning them the nickname Canary Girls, but their relentless work produced the shells that fueled the artillery. Women took over in heavy industries, operating cranes, working in shipyards, and even performing blacksmithing. They toiled in the fields, ensuring food production continued. They drove buses, trams, and delivery vehicles, keeping cities moving. In offices, they became clerks, typists, and administrators. Closer to the front lines, women served as nurses, ambulance drivers, and support staff. Private Ethel M. Gordon, a British Voluntary Aid Detachment, VAD, nurse, wrote in her diary near the Somme in 1916, "The convoys never stop. Just when you think you've cleared the last stretcher, another one arrives, and another. The wounds, oh, the wounds. Faces blown apart, limbs gone, bodies twisted. You try to keep a professional distance, but sometimes, a young boy, barely older than my brother, crying for his mother, and you just want to take him home. We work till we drop, sleep for a few hours, then start again. It's endless. But we must. The boys need us. This immense and varied contribution proved beyond doubt that women were capable of performing demanding work, often under immense pressure. A quiet revolution, the war's impact on women's rights. The direct consequence of women's vital wartime contributions was a dramatic shift in societal attitudes towards their capabilities and their place in public life. The arguments against women's suffrage, often based on notions of female fragility or inability to participate in public affairs, crumbled in the face of their demonstrable competence in traditionally male-dominated roles. This quiet revolution laid undeniable groundwork for significant social and political change. Soon after the war, major Western nations began granting women the right to vote, the United Kingdom in 1918, for women over 30, later extended, Germany in 1919, the United States in 1920, and many others followed suit. Beyond suffrage, women gained greater economic independence, entered new professions, and challenged traditional gender roles, influencing fashion, leisure activities, and social expectations. The war, for all its horror, irrevocably reshaped the social landscape, creating a more modern, if still imperfect, role for women in society. The unseen casualties, civilians under attack. Total war meant that the battlefield was no longer a distant concept. Civilians, previously largely immune from direct enemy action, found themselves on the front line, subjected to new forms of terror and displacement, and ultimately to a global biological catastrophe. Bombs from the sky, Zeppelin raids and the home front's new fear. For the first time in history, large-scale aerial bombing brought the war directly to the homes of civilians. Germany pioneered this new horror, using its massive Zeppelin airships for bombing raids over British cities, including London, as early as 1915. Later, more conventional Gotha bombers took over, conducting day and night raids. While the material damage from these early raids was limited compared to later conflicts, the psychological impact was immense. The sight of silent, silvery Zeppelins drifting over rooftops, the terrifying drone of bomber engines, and the explosions of bombs brought a new, visceral fear to the home front. Civilians crammed into improvised air raid shelters, wrestled with blackout regulations, and lived under the constant threat of unseen death from above. It was a stark manifestation of total war, shattering the modern lie that one's home was a sanctuary, and demonstrating that the front line now extended deep into civilian populations. Refugees of war, millions on the move. The vast movements of armies and the brutal nature of combat, especially on the Eastern Front, led to the unprecedented mass displacement of populations. Millions of civilians became refugees, fleeing from invading armies, scorched earth tactics, or the systematic brutality of occupation. On the Eastern Front, entire regions of Russia, Poland, and Galicia saw populations uprooted by retreating and advancing armies. In the West, hundreds of thousands of Belgians and northern French fled their homes as the German army advanced. These refugees often faced immense suffering, loss of homes and livelihoods, family separation, starvation, disease, and exploitation. They placed enormous strain on the resources of neutral countries or less affected regions, highlighting the profound human cost of total war beyond the battlefield casualties. The invisible plague, how the Spanish flu added to the carnage. As the Great War neared its end in 1918, new, unseen enemy emerged from the chaos and devastation, adding an unimaginable layer of carnage, the Spanish flu pandemic. This highly virulent strain of influenza, likely originating in the United States, spread rapidly across the globe, tragically facilitated by the massive movement of troops and civilians enabled by the war. The Spanish flu was unusually lethal, particularly targeting young, healthy adults, aged 20 to 40, the very demographic fighting the war. Victims often succumbed rapidly, sometimes within hours, to pneumonia or respiratory failure. The pandemic swept through military camps, troop transports, and overcrowded cities, debilitating armies and disrupting supply lines at a critical juncture in the war. More devastatingly, it ravaged civilian populations worldwide. Estimates for its global death toll vary wildly, from 20 million to as high as 100 million, far exceeding the war's combat casualties. The modern lie, that humanity's greatest threat was only itself and its wars, was brutally exposed by this silent, invisible plague, a final, horrifying demonstration of the true, uncontainable cost of a world under siege.
I hope you enjoyed this video. If you do, please don't forget to like, comment and share this video. Also don't forget to subscribe the channel and press the bell icon, so that you don't miss out the next video. For now, you can continue with the next video or can go through the complete playlist provided here.